Have you ever thought about like those simple agreements we make every day, like a handshake deal or just a promise? What gives those agreements actual weight, especially like legally? Today, we are going to really look deep at one story, and it shows how complex even the most basic agreement can be. And get this, it all comes from a case that ended up in the New York Court of Appeals back in 1891 called Hamer v. Sidway.
Yep, and you know what's at the heart of this whole thing?
What's that?
A pretty straightforward question. Let's say, an uncle says to his nephew, hey, I'll give you a good chunk of money. We're talking $5,000, which was a lot back then if you agree to give up some, youthful habits.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Does that promise become like a real contract, legally binding?
That is a really interesting question. So, yeah, the learner, that's what we are going to untangle for you today, this idea of consideration. It's this special ingredient that turns a casual promise into something a court will enforce. And by diving deep into this one family story, we'll pull out the big legal ideas that still matter today.
Oh, for sure.
And you know what our main source is for all of this?
What's that?
The actual court decision from Hamer v. Sidway, straight from the New York Court of Appeal.
All right, let's get into it. So imagine this. March 20th, 1869, William E. Story. He makes an offer to his nephew. Now, this nephew is also named William E. Story, but we'll call him William II, just to keep it straight.
Good idea.
So the uncle promises to pay this William II $5,000 when he turns 21, but there's a catch, right?
Oh, there's always a catch. What do you have to do?
Young William had to stay away from a few, shall we say, vices?
Mm-hmm.
No drinking liquor, using tobacco, swearing, and no gambling, specifically cards or billiards.
Now, those are some specific vices.
They were popular back then. Anyway, nearly 6 years go by, and the nephew turns 21. The trial court even confirmed. William II, he kept his word. He avoided all those things he promised to. But when he went to get his $5,000, well, things got complicated.
Yeah, I bet. Why? What happened?
Well, the uncle sadly passed away. So his executor, a guy named Franklin Sidway, enters the scene. And this Sidway basically says the whole agreement wasn't a real contract at all.
Whoa, hold on. Why would he say that?
His argument basically comes down to this. The nephew didn't really suffer by abstaining from those vices. You could even argue it was good for him.
Yeah, I guess so. Like healthier choices.
Right. So Sidway claims the uncle's promise lacked consideration. That's the legal thing you need to make a promise into a contract that holds up in court. He's basically saying unless the uncle directly benefited from the nephew's actions, the contract wasn't valid.
Wow. That could really change how we think about contracts, right? Imagine having to prove that something you agreed to actually benefited you, so the other person's promise counts.
Absolutely. This case really struck at a fundamental idea in contract law. What makes a promise into something you can enforce in court? So the court dug into the legal definitions of consideration, and they focused on one from the Exchequer Chamber in England. It's from 1875 and super important.
Lay it on us.
It says, a valuable consideration in the sense of the law may consist either in some right, interest, profit, or benefit accruing to the one party, or some forbearance, detriment, loss, or responsibility given, suffered, or undertaken by the other.
That or in there is huge, right? It's not just about one person getting some profit.
Exactly. The court really hammered this home. They said, we will not ask whether the thing that forms the consideration actually benefits the person who's promised something or a third party, or even if it has any real value to anyone. It is enough that something is promised, done, given up, or suffered by the one who's promised something, and that acts as consideration for the promise made to them.
I'm starting to see how this is all going to come together. They weren't messing around.
They even brought in what legal scholars had to say. For example, Anson's Principles of Contract. It's like a legal textbook. And it states, it is enough that something is promised, done, forborne, or suffered by the party to whom the promise is made as consideration for the promise made to him. See, the focus is on what the person who was promised something does or gives up, not necessarily what the promiser gets out of it.
It's like the emphasis is on the receiver of the promise.
Yeah, and they also cited Parsons on contracts, which highlights something crucial. In general, waiving a legal right at the request of someone else is enough consideration for a promise. Think about that. If you willingly give up something you're allowed to do by law, just because someone asked you to, and they promise you something in return, that can make their promise legally binding.
Okay, I'm following you.
And then we've got Kent's commentaries, which says, any damage or suspension or forbearance of a right will be sufficient to sustain a promise. Again, the emphasis is on what the person getting the promise does or doesn't do, especially if it's about not using a right they have.
Right.
And Pollock, in his book on contracts, brings it all home. He says, consideration means not so much that one party is profiting, as that the other abandons some legal right in the present, or limits his legal freedom of action in the future as an inducement for the promise of the first.
So how does all this high-level legal stuff apply to our story about the uncle and nephew? That's what I'm waiting for.
Okay, let's bring it back down to earth. The court was very clear that young William II, he totally had the legal right to drink, use tobacco, swear, even gamble. Nothing stopped him legally.
Right. It wasn't like there were laws against those things back then.
Exactly. No legal obligation to be, a perfect little angel. But because of his uncle's promise, he did hold back from doing any of that until he was 21. He chose to restrict his own freedom based on that promise.
That's true. He did what he said he would.
And the court says, that's the heart of it. It doesn't even matter if the uncle thought he was doing his nephew a favor, or if the nephew got healthier by abstaining. What makes it a contract is that the nephew gave up rights he had, specifically because of that promise. The court wasn't interested in measuring if the uncle actually gained anything concrete from the nephew's good behavior.
Fascinating. And they used other cases to back this up, right?
Yep. Like, they mentioned Shadwell v. Shadwell. It's a case where an uncle promised his nephew some money each year after he got married. And the court decided that getting married was enough consideration for the promise. The interesting thing is, the nephew was probably going to get married anyway, but the promise gave him extra reason to, and it was tied to something he had a right to do.
That's a neat little twist.
Yeah.
What about other examples?
Oh, there's also an interesting one from Massachusetts called Lakota v. Newton. It wasn't officially published, but the idea it shows is clear. In that case, someone promised the plaintiff $100 if he stayed away from alcohol for a year. And the court said, nope, there is valid consideration because the plaintiff chose to stop drinking, even though he didn't have to.
Ah, so it's about the choice to give something up. Interesting. Yeah. Didn't you mention another case from Kentucky?
Oh, yeah. Talbot v. Stemmons. That one's very similar to Hamer v. Sidway. It involved a step-grandmother who promised her grandson 500 smackers if he didn't use tobacco while she was alive. And guess what the Kentucky Court of Appeals said?
How did they say?
Get this. They said, and I quote, "The right to use and enjoy the use of tobacco was a right that belonged to the plaintiff and not forbidden by law, the abandonment of its use. Nevertheless, the surrender of that right caused the promise. The abandonment of the use was a sufficient consideration to uphold the promise."
So they're turning. It was his right to use tobacco, but he gave that up, and that's enough to make the promise binding. Wow.
It's a pattern, right? Giving up a legal right in exchange for a promise equals valid consideration. They even brought up a Missouri case, Lindell v. Rokes, where not drinking alcohol was good enough consideration for a promissory note. This idea was gaining a lot of traction in the courts back then.
Okay, I'm really seeing how strong this argument is now.
The court in Hamer v. Sidway was building on a solid base of legal decisions that had already come before. But the defendant in this case, he tried to argue against it, citing other legal cases.
Oh, yeah, you mentioned that earlier. What was the court's reasoning for saying those other cases didn't apply here?
Well, the court went through each of the defendant's cases carefully and explained why they weren't relevant. A few of them, like Mallory v. Gillette and Belknap v. Bender, had to do with what's called the statute of frauds.
The statute of frauds, what's that all about?
Basically, it's a law saying certain important agreements need to be written down to be enforceable. One type is agreements that can't be finished within a year of being made. Since the uncle's promise was about waiting until the nephew turned 21, which is more than a year, it could have been a problem.
Right.
But the court said this defense wasn't brought up correctly in the early legal arguments. And even more importantly, they pointed to the uncle's letter and things he said out loud after the nephew turned 21. It showed that he totally waived any problem with the statute of frauds. His words and actions made it clear he considered the agreement valid, even though there wasn't a fancy written contract.
Interesting. What about those other cases the defendant cited, the ones about moral obligation?
Right. Those were about situations where someone made a promise based on a sense of duty or honor, like in Beaumont v. Reeve. It's not like there was a real exchange of legal rights. The court said that, sure, morals matter, but they don't automatically create a legally binding contract. You need that consideration element, that something of legal value was given up or taken on.
Okay. So just feeling obligated isn't enough. And what about those cases with pre-existing legal obligation?
Right. Those were cases like Vanderbilt v. Schreier. Imagine someone is already required by law to do something. They can't then turn around and use that same action as the consideration for a new promise. The court was super clear. You can't just use something you're already legally obligated to do as consideration for a new contract. And in our case, the nephew had no obligation to avoid those vices before he made the agreement with his uncle.
So it was his free choice to make that deal. Gotcha.
It's important to understand those differences. The court was showing how the uncle and nephew's agreement was different from those other cases.
Makes sense. But hold on. Let's go back to that statute of frauds thing for a sec. The original agreement wasn't written down, and it was meant to last for years. So how did the court get around that issue?
That's a good catch. Technically, the agreement could have been challenged under this statute of frauds. But, as we said, the court noticed that the defendant didn't bring it up properly at the beginning of the lawsuit. More importantly, though, the uncle's later letter and things he said, those were like waving the statute of frauds problem goodbye. He basically acknowledged the agreement was valid, even without a super formal written contract.
So are we done with legal technicalities now? Can we get back to the story?
Yeah, for sure. So the nephew, he has his 21st birthday in January 1875. Right away, he writes to his uncle wanting his $5,000.
Of course, that's what the whole thing was about.
Exactly. The nephew's letter, dated January 31st, 1875, was pretty simple. It said, "Dear Uncle, I am now 21 years old today, and I am now my own boss, and I believe, according to agreement, that there is due me $5,000. I have lived up to the contract to the letter in every sense of the word."
To the point. I like it. And I'm guessing the uncle's reply is where things get more interesting.
You bet. The uncle wrote back just a few days later on February 6th, and his letter changes the whole game.
Read it to us. Read it to us.
All right, here goes. "Dear nephew, your letter of the 31st ult. Came to hand all right, saying that you had lived up to the promise made to me several years ago. I have no doubt but you have, for which you shall have $5,000 as I promised you. I had the money in the bank the day you was 21 years old that I intended for you, and you shall have the money certain. Now, Willie, I don't intend to interfere with this money in any way until I think you are capable of taking care of it, and the sooner that time comes, the better it will please me. I would hate very much to have you start out in some adventure that you thought all right and lose this money in 1 year. This money you have earned much easier than I did, besides acquiring good habits at the same time, and you are quite welcome to the money. Hope you will make good use of it. W.E. Story. P.S. You can consider this money on interest."
Whoa. Okay, so the uncle's like, yeah, you did it. You get the money. But then he's like, hold your horses. I'm going to hang on to it for a while.
Yeah. The uncle admits he owes the money, but says he'll hold on to it until the nephew is, let's say, mature enough to handle it. That creates a whole new legal question, doesn't it?
It totally does.
Right.
Was it still just a simple debt? Or did this turn into something else?
Right. The court had to decide if it was still just debtor and creditor. If so, that whole statute of limitations thing, that's the legal time limit on lawsuits. The defendant brought it up. And it could have meant the nephew couldn't get the money because too much time had passed.
Oh, wow. So that time limit could have messed everything up.
It could have. But the other option was, did that letter and the nephew going along with it create a trust? Like, did the uncle become a trustee holding the money for his nephew's benefit?
Oh, I get it. So is it a simple I owe you, or is it something more like I'm holding on to this for you?
Exactly. And you know what the court decided?
Tell me.
They said it was a trust.
Really? Based on that letter, it doesn't sound super official.
Right. But the court said you don't need fancy lawyer words to make a trust. What matters is what the person setting up the trust, the settler, intended. As long as it's clear what property is part of the trust, the $5,000 in this case, and who it's for, the nephew, and the settler clearly means to hold that property for the beneficiary, that's usually enough. They even cited Lewin on trusts, which is like the trust law Bible, to back this up.
So even though the uncle didn't say, I'm making a trust, in those exact words, his actions and the way he wrote that letter were enough to show he meant to make one, right?
Exactly. And get this, they also use Story's equity jurisprudence, which basically supports the idea that if someone has money legally and says clearly they're holding it in trust for someone else, and the beneficiary is okay with that, and it's all based on valid consideration, which the original agreement provided, boom, you've got yourself a trustee.
Wow. So many legal layers. And there was that other case they mentioned too, right? Davy Roth.
Yeah. In that one, a debtor agreed to invest money for a creditor, and that was enough to create a trust. The key seems to be that the uncle took on a specific duty with the money, not just owing it as a regular debt.
He wasn't just like, oh yeah, I owe you that. He was like, I'm taking care of this for you.
Precisely. The court focused on how the nephew would have reasonably understood the uncle's letter, citing the case of White v. Hoyt. The uncle said he had the money set aside just for him, and he wouldn't mess with it until he thought the nephew could handle it. That really points to him holding the money for the nephew's benefit, not as some random debt.
Okay, those phrases like, you shall have the money certain, and I don't intend to interfere with this money, they definitely sound like he's treating it differently. So, did the court decide that all the pieces of a trust were there?
Yep, they did. And the nephew, by not objecting and seemingly going along with it, agreed to this new arrangement. It wasn't just a simple debt anymore, it was a trust. And that was huge because it changed the legal rules around it. It meant that statute of limitations thing couldn't be used to stop the nephew from getting the money.
Wow, that was a close one.
It was. Just to wrap up the story, the nephew eventually gave his rights to the money to his wife, Libby H. Story, who then gave them to the plaintiff in the case, Louisa W. Hamer.
So it was like a chain of, okay, you take it.
Right. And in the end, the New York Court of Appeals, they were like, nope, lower court, you got it wrong. They upheld the original judgment, which was in favor of Mrs. Hamer.
So the higher court agreed. Mrs. Hamer deserved that money.
Yes. The court was clear. The initial contract was valid because the nephew's giving something up was enough consideration, legally speaking. And they also recognized that debt then turned into a proper trust.
So, the learner, what can we take away from all of this?
Yeah.
What's the big deal about Hamer v. Sidway?
The big idea here is this. When it comes to contracts, consideration doesn't always mean one side gets a concrete benefit. It can be that the other side willingly gives up a right they have, regardless of whether the person making the promise directly gains anything.
That's pretty mind-blowing when you think about it.
It is. This family agreement from way back in the 1800s set a huge legal precedent that still shapes how we understand contracts even today.
It's amazing how one story can have such a lasting impact. So, what should the learner be thinking about after hearing all of this?
Here's a thought to chew on. How many promises and agreements in your daily life actually involve one person giving up some freedom or a right? Even in casual settings, this legal principle might be in play. Does knowing about consideration change how you see those everyday exchanges? Does it make you think differently about what's really being traded, even in agreements that might seem one-sided at first glance? It's a powerful way to look at the hidden dynamics of all the promises we make and keep.
It really makes you think.
It does.
Well, that was quite the deep dive.
It was, wasn't it?
Thanks for joining me on this exploration of Hamer v. Sidway, and until next time, the learner, keep those legal gears turning.
And remember, every promise has a story.